The summer heat in Louisiana, Missouri, had settled into the town like a heavy blanket. The Mississippi River moved slowly along the eastern edge of the town, its muddy water reflecting the pale orange of the evening sky. Cicadas screamed in the trees. Porch lights flickered on one by one as families finished dinner and children drifted back indoors. Louisiana, Missouri was not a place where strange things happened. Population barely over 3,000, a quiet river town where everyone knew everyone, where the biggest news of the week might be a finishing contest or a high school football game. But in the July of 1972, something happened that would change the town's reputation forever. It started with children. Several kids had been playing in a backyard near the edge of the town when they suddenly ran back toward the house in complete panic. They were screaming, crying, pointing toward the trees. At first, the adults thought it was nothing, maybe a dog, maybe a stray animal moving through the brush. But the children kept repeating the same words. They had seen something big, something covered in dark hair, and something that had been watching them. When one of the fathers stepped outside to look, he expected to find nothing, but near the edge of the yard, in the tall grass, he saw movement, a large figure stepping slowly behind the trees. For just a moment, it stood upright, tall, broad, dark fur hanging in thick patches across its body. Then it disappeared into the woods. The children would later say something else they noticed, something the adults didn't understand at the time. The creature's face looked almost human. Within days, the town would give the creature a name, a strange nickname that sounded almost harmless, but the stories that followed would make it one of the most unsettling cryptid legends in the American Midwest. They called it Momo, the Missouri Monster. And by the time the sightings spread across the forests surrounding Missouri, people realized something disturbing. This creature wasn't just passing through, it seemed to be living there. Word traveled fast. By the next afternoon, nearly everyone in town had heard the story about the children who ran screaming from the yard and the large hairy figure seen moving through the trees. At first, most people laughed it off. Kids imagine things, shadows move in strange ways in the summer heat. Someone probably saw a large dog or a wandering deer, but the story didn't stop. More people began noticing things around the wooded areas outside town. Strange movements between the trees, branches snapping where no deer should have been. And then there was the smell. It was the smell that people talked about the most. Several residents living near the wooded creek beds began reporting a powerful odor drifting through the air at night. It wasn't the usual scent of swamp water or river mud. This was different, thick, rotting, almost unbearable. One man described it as something dead mixed with wet garbage. Another said it smelled like an animal that had been living in the same place for years without ever leaving. And wherever that smell appeared, strange things seemed to follow. Late one evening, a group of teenagers decided to walk near the tree line outside town, hoping they might see whatever had frightened the children the night before. They carried flashlights and laughed nervously as they moved through the tall grass. At first, everything felt normal. Crickets chirped, leaves rustled in the warm wind. But then the smell arrived. Sudden, overwhelming, so strong that one of the boys covered his nose and gagged. The group stopped walking. The forest around them had gone quiet. Their flashlight beams moved slowly across the trees, the bushes, the dark spaces between the trunks. Then one of them whispered, "Did you see that?" Someone had moved behind the trees, large, too tall to be a deer. The boys swung their lights toward the movement. For a brief second, something stepped into the edge of the beam. A tall shape, covered in dark hair, its arms hanging long at its sides, and its face. Its face looked strangely flat, almost human. The creature froze. The boys froze. Then, with a sudden burst of speed that none of them expected, the figure turned and crashed through the brush, disappearing deeper into the woods surrounding Missouri. The teenagers ran all the way back to the town, and that night the name everyone had been whispering suddenly felt much more real. The creature people had begun calling Momo had just been seen again, closer than ever before. The next morning, curiosity replaced laughter in Louisiana, Missouri. Too many people had now seen the same thing: children, teenagers, adults, all describing a large, hairy creature moving through the wooded hills outside town. So a few of the local men decided to check the area where the teenagers had run into the woods the night before. They arrived early, when the ground was still damp for the heavy summer humidity. At first, they saw nothing unusual, just the tall grass bending in the morning breeze and the faint sound of insects humming in the heat. But as they moved deeper toward the tree line, one of the men suddenly stopped walking. He pointed toward the ground. There, pressed into the soft mud near the edge of the woods, was a footprint. Not the footprint of a deer, not the track of a dog, a human-shaped footprint, but enormous, nearly twice the size of a normal man's foot. The men stood around it silently. Another footprint appeared several feet ahead, and then another, a line of them leading toward the trees. Each step spaced far apart, suggesting something with a long, powerful stride had walked through the area during the night. One of the men placed his own boot next to the track. His foot looked small beside it. And that's when the smell hit them. The same powerful odor the townspeople had been talking about. Rotting, sore, thick in the humid air. It drifted out of the woods as if something inside the forest was breathing slowly, waiting. The men followed the tracks a little farther, but the prints soon disappeared where the ground turned rocky. Whatever had made them had moved deeper into the forests surrounding Missouri, and by the time the group returned to town, the story had grown even bigger, because now they had something more than sightings. They had evidence. Footprints, massive ones, proof that whatever people had seen in the woods wasn't just imagination. Something large had been walking through Louisiana, something strong enough to move silently through thick forest, something tall enough to stand eye to eye with a grown man. And as the rumors spread through the town, one thing became clear. The creature people were calling Momo wasn't just a shadow in the trees anymore. It was leaving tracks behind. By the second week of July 1972, the mood in Louisiana had changed. People were no longer laughing about the creature in the woods. Too many sightings had been reported. Too many people had smelled the same foul odor drifting through the summer air. And now something else happened, something that made the entire town uneasy. It involved children again. One afternoon, several kids were playing near a wooded ravine on the edge of town. The place was familiar to them. They had run through those trees dozens of times before, but that day felt different. The woods were strangely quiet. No birds, no squirrels moving through the branches. One of the boys later said he felt something before he saw anything, a strange feeling like someone was watching them from the trees. Then the smell arrived, sharp, rotten, thick in the hot air. The children turned toward the brush, and that's when they saw it. Standing partly hidden behind the trees was a large figure, tall, covered in dark, tangled hair. Its shoulders were wide, its arms hanging long at its sides, but what frightened the children the most was the creature's face. Unlike an animal's snout or muzzle, the face looked strangely flat, almost human. The creature stood there silently, watching them. For a moment, no one moved. Then one of the girls screamed. The creature shifted its weight and stepped forward slightly, breaking a branch beneath its foot. That sound was enough. The children turned and ran. They didn't stop running until they reached the nearest house, where they burst through the door crying and shouting over each other. When the adults returned to the ravine to investigate, the creature was gone, but the smell lingered in the air, and the tall grass near the tree line had been flattened as if something very large had been standing there, observing. By that evening, the entire town was talking about it. The creature had come close again, closer than before, and the unsettling realization began to spread across Missouri. Whatever Momo was, it wasn't afraid of people. In fact, it seemed perfectly comfortable watching them. By mid-July, the stories had spread beyond the quiet streets of Louisiana. What had started as frightened children and a few strange sightings was now becoming something much larger. Phone calls began reaching the local authorities. Parents wanted answers. Farmers living near the wooded ravines were uneasy. Hunters reported hearing heavy movement in the forests at night. Eventually, the situation reached the attention of the local sheriff's department in Pike County. Deputies drove out to the areas where the sightings had been reported. They walked through the tall grass near the ravines, checked the muddy creek beds, and spoke with the families whose children had seen the creature. At first, the officers approached the situation cautiously. Small towns sometimes experienced waves of rumors. One story could spread quickly, especially when it involved something mysterious in the woods. But the deputies quickly realized something unusual. Every witness described almost the same creature, tall, covered in dark hair, long arms, a strong, terrible smell that seemed to arrive before the creature itself appeared. Some residents even claimed the odor could be detected hundreds of feet away. During one search near a wooded creek outside town, the deputies noticed broken branches along a narrow trail cutting through the undergrowth. The branches were high, far higher than a normal person would brush against while walking. And then they found more tracks, large impressions in the soft mud along the creek bank. The deputies examined them carefully. The shapes resembled human footprints, but the size was enormous. The stride between them suggested something tall, possibly well over 6 feet. For a moment, the officers stood quietly along the water's edge. The forest around them seemed still. Then one of them noticed something drifting around the humid air. That same smell, rotten, heavy, almost unbearable. It seemed to roll slowly out of the trees surrounding the creek. The deputies scanned the woods carefully, their eyes moving between the trunks and shadows. Nothing moved, but the feeling that something was watching them from deeper in the forest was impossible to ignore. When the officers returned to town that evening, they couldn't offer a clear explanation, but they also couldn't dismiss what they had seen. By now, people across Missouri had begun hearing about the strange creature being spotted near Louisiana. And the strange nickname people had started using, half joking at first, was now appearing in newspapers and conversations alike. They called it Momo, the Missouri monster, and if the tracks and sightings were real, then something very large was still moving through the forests outside town. By the third week of July 1972, the quiet river of Louisiana had become the center of an unusual kind of attention. The sightings of Momo were no longer just local rumors. Newspapers from nearby towns began sending reporters. Curious travelers started driving through the area. Hunters, trackers, and amateur investigators arrived hoping to catch a glimpse of the creature people were describing. Soon, informal search groups began forming. Some carried rifles, others carried cameras. A few simply wanted to walk through the woods and see if the strange stories were true. They moved through the forest trails outside town, especially near the ravines and creek beds where the largest footprints had been found. But the forests in this part of Missouri were dense, thick undergrowth tangled around fallen logs. Tall trees blocked the sunlight in places, turning the woods into a maze of shadow and green darkness. Perfect places for something large to hide. Many searchers reported hearing unusual sounds while walking those trails. Heavy footsteps moving somewhere beyond the trees, branches snapping where nothing could be seen. Sometimes they would suddenly smell the same overpowering odor people had described since the beginning. And every time the smell appeared, the same strange feeling followed, the sense that something nearby was aware of them, watching, waiting. One group of hunters later claimed they heard something large moving parallel to them through the woods, keeping the same distance no matter how fast they walked. They never saw it, but they heard it, a slow, deliberate movement through the brush. When they stopped walking, the sound stopped. When they started again, the movement continued, as if something in the forest was quietly following them. By the end of the day, the hunters left the woods without answers, but the story of the strange creature outside Louisiana continued spreading, and with each passing day, the legend of Momo grew larger, because despite all the people searching for it, no one had managed to catch it. Whatever was moving through those woods seemed to know the forest far better than anyone looking for it. As the searches continued around Louisiana, many people claimed they had heard something moving in the woods, but one man would later describe an encounter that was far more direct. Late one evening, just before sunset, a local resident was driving alone a narrow rural road outside town. The road cut between stretches of farmland and dense woods that followed the hills near the Mississippi River Valley. The sky was turning orange as the sun dropped behind the trees. That's when he noticed movement near the edge of a field. At first, he thought it was a person standing near the tree line, but something about the shape didn't look right. The figure was too broad, too tall. The man slowed his truck and stared toward the trees, and then the figure stepped forward. For a brief moment, it stood fully in the open. The man would later describe it as nearly 7 feet tall. Its body was covered in dark, matted hair that hung unevenly across its shoulders and arms. The arms themselves seemed unusually long, reaching well past its waist, but the face was that what stayed with him, not like a bear, not like a monkey. The face looked strangely flat, almost human, with deep-set eyes that seemed to reflect the fading sunlight. The creature looked directly toward the truck. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then the smell hit him. The same overpowering odor people had been reporting for weeks, rotting, sore, like something that had lived deep in the woods for years without ever coming near civilization. The man felt a sudden chill run through him. Before he could even react, the creature turned and moved quickly back toward the trees. Despite its size, it disappeared into the forest with surprising speed. Within seconds, the woods were silent again. The man sat in his truck for a moment, staring at the empty tree line. When he finally drove back into town, he reported what he had seen, and his description matched nearly every other sighting. Tall, hair-covered, long arms, and that unforgettable smell. By now, people across Missouri were hearing about the strange creatures being seen near Louisiana. The legend of Momo was no longer just a local rumor. It was becoming one of the most talked about cryptid sightings in the Midwest. But the strangest part was still coming, because the next reports would suggest that the creature might not have been alone. By late July, the woods surrounding Louisiana had become the center of constant attention. During the day, curious visitors wandered the trails hoping to see the creature people were calling Momo, but the strangest activity seemed to happen after sunset. One humid night, a small group of local men decided to watch the woods from a distance rather than search inside them. They parked near a gravel road overlooking a stretch of forest that had produced several sightings. The moon was hidden behind clouds. The woods looked like a wall of darkness. For a long time, nothing happened. Only the steady hum of insects and the distant sound of the Mississippi River moving through the valley. Then something changed. One of the men noticed movement deep inside the tree line. Not a single shape, multiple movements, branches swaying in different places at once. The men leaned forward in their seats, watching the dark forest carefully. Then they heard it, a deep sound that echoed faintly through the woods. Not a quiet growl, not quite a howl. Something low and strange that seemed to travel through the trees. The men looked at each other uneasily. A few moments later, another sound came from farther away in the forest, almost like a response. The sounds moved slowly through the woods, echoing back and forth between distant points. And then the smell arrived, the same thick, unbearable odor drifting through the night air. One of the men whispered quietly, "It's here." They aimed their flashlights toward the trees, but the beams only illuminated the outer edge of the forest. Beyond that, darkness swallowed everything. For several minutes, the sounds continued somewhere inside the woods. Heavy movement, branches snapping. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the forest went quiet again. The men waited. Nothing moved. Whatever had been there had slipped back into the darkness of the forest surrounding Missouri, but the experience left them with a disturbing thought. The sounds had not come from just one direction. They had come from different places in the woods, which raised a question no one in town had asked before. What if Momo wasn't the only one out there? By early August of 1972, the strange events around Louisiana were no longer just a local mystery. The story had spread far beyond the quiet town along the Mississippi River. Newspapers across Missouri began publishing articles about the creature people were calling Momo. Soon, radio stations picked up the story. Then television reporters arrived. Cameras followed investigators as they walked the same wooded ravines where the first sightings had taken place. Reporters interviewed residents who described the tall, hairy figure moving through the trees and the powerful odor that seemed to appear before it. For a short time, the small town of Louisiana became the center of a national curiosity. Some people believed the witnesses completely, others were skeptical. Wildlife experts suggested the sightings might have been misidentified animals, perhaps a large black bear standing on its hind legs. But many locals disagreed. They had lived in those woods their entire lives. They knew the difference between a bear and something else. And they insisted the creature they had seen did not move like an animal they recognized. As more attention arrived, so did more investigators. Some were amateur researchers fascinated by cryptids. Others were serious trackers hoping to find physical proof of the creature. They searched the wooded hills, the creek beds, and the thick forest trails outside town. But the deeper they went, the more frustrating the mystery became. They found broken branches, occasional tracks that were difficult to identify, and sometimes the faint smell people had described since the very beginning. But the creature itself remained elusive. It appeared only for brief moments, always at the edge of the woods, always disappearing before anyone could get close. And slowly, another strange pattern began to emerge. As the national attention grew louder, the sightings started becoming less frequent, as if whatever had been moving through the forests around Louisiana had noticed the sudden presence of cameras and searchers, and decided it was time to disappear. But the mystery of Momo was not finished yet, because one final encounter would leave the town with a question that has never been fully answered. By the end of the summer 1972, the excitement surrounding Momo had begun to slow. Reporters who once crowded the streets of Louisiana were leaving. The search parties that had filled the woods weeks earlier were becoming smaller and less frequent. For many people, the creature had already turned into a strange summer story, but for one man, the mystery became far more personal. Late one evening, a farmer was driving back toward his property just outside town. The gravel road ran between their thick patches of forest and open farmland. The sky had already turned dark, only the truck's headlights cut through the quiet road ahead. As he rounded a bend near a wooded area, something stepped onto the road. The farmer immediately hit the brakes. The truck came to a slow stop, the headlights shining directly toward the figure standing in front of him. For a moment, he couldn't fully understand what he was looking at. The shape was massive, at least 7 feet tall. Its body was thick and powerful, covered in dark hair that looked uneven and tangled. The creature stood upright in the center of the road, unmoving. The farmer later said the creature seemed completely calm, not startled, not frightened, almost as if it had chosen to step out into the light. For several seconds, the two simply stared at each other. Then the man noticed the creature's eyes reflecting the headlights, deep, dark, intelligent. And then the smell reached him through the open window of the truck. That same overpowering odor people in town had been describing for weeks. Rotten, sharp, unmistakable. The creature tilted its head slightly, studying the truck as if trying to understand it. Then, with slow, deliberate steps, it crossed the road and disappeared into the woods on the other side. No running, no panic, just quiet movement. Within seconds, the forest swallowed it completely. The farmer remained sitting behind the wheel for a long time, staring at the empty road, because what he had just seen didn't look like a bear. It didn't move like any animal he knew. It walked like something else entirely, something that had been moving through the forests of Missouri for a very long time. And that encounter would become one of the last widely reported sightings connected to Momo. After that night, the creature seemed to vanish back into the wilderness. Even after the last reporter encounter, the mystery of Momo didn't end. People in Louisiana and the surrounding countryside continued to find strange signs in the woods. Large footprints, sometimes pressed deeply into soft mud, appeared sporadically. Broken branches and flattened grass suggested something enormous moving through the forest. And the same thick, pungent odor, the unmistakable signature of Momo, would occasionally drift from the creek beds or dense thickets. Experts and cryptozoologists debated the creature's identity. Some suggested it could be a misidentified black bear standing upright. Others believed it might be a previously unknown species of primate or ape, somehow surviving in the Missouri forests. A few local residents had theories of their own. Some whispered that Momo was a survivor of some long-lost or escaped circus animal, while others insisted it was a guardian of the forests, a creature that had always lived there long before the town was built. Despite the attention, no one captured definitive photographic evidence. No specimen was collected, no scientific confirmation ever occurred, and yet the stories persisted. For decades, hunters and hikers claimed fleeting glimpses of a large, dark figure moving through the trees. They reported the same flat, almost human-like face, the long arms, and the unsettling sense of being watched. The Missouri monster had left a legacy, a small town forever marked by a summer in which something strange and powerful walked among the trees. Momo wasn't just a creature, it was a legend, a reminder that some corners of America's forests are still wild, and that some mysteries never really go away. Years passed, but the tale of Momo never faded from Louisiana. New generations of children grew up hearing about the dark-haired figure that stalked the edges of woods. Parents warned them not to wander too far after sunset, Hunters kept a careful eye on the shadows between the trees. Even today, locals swear that on humid summer nights, the air carries a faint, pungent odor, Momo's signature scent, and the distant sound of heavy, deliberate footsteps echoes through the forest. Occasionally, some would claim a sighting, a fleeting glimpse of a massive shape moving through the trees, a shadow that seemed too human to belong to a peer. Footprints found in muddy creek beds, just like those discovered decades ago. Cryptozoologists still study the forests of Missouri, hoping for proof. Researchers revisit old accounts, examining the descriptions of those who had seen it firsthand, but the truth remains elusive. Momo may never be caught, it may never be fully explained, and perhaps that's why the legend endures. The Missouri Monster is more than a story, it's a reminder that the wilderness still holds secrets, that the forests of Louisiana are alive with mysteries beyond human understanding. Some say if you listen carefully on a quiet summer night, you might hear the soft, measured steps of Momo moving through the woods, watching, waiting, unseen, yet very much real. The Missouri Monster isn't gone, it's always been there, and some legends are meant to last forever.